we've been going through different European countries, trying to illuminate. If we go back to this original idea that in any society, if you really want to understand the society, you got to study the souls of the leaders and the ideas that are in those souls, because that will help you to reveal the nature of the society over time. So we've been looking at, yesterday we did kind of a sweep of the United States, especially of Catholics in the United States. And we went over this whole theory of ethnic federalism. One thing I just would want to add to just some of the evidence that we gave last night is that I think I did mention this, that in the 1920s and 1930s, in a lot of the social science literature, there was just an explicit discussion of the demographic problem. And the demographic problem being that they were basically, there was this kind of fear that, and it was a scientific fear. It was all done kind of objective, supposedly for the time, objective social science. That by 1980, Catholics would have a majority of the country and they would basically ruin it. So in 2003, I think it was 2002 or 2003, there was this professor at Harvard named Samuel Huntington. And he wrote a book called Who Are We? And the purpose of this book was to express his concern about basically Mexican immigration to the United States. And what's really interesting about this debate is that when I was reading this book and I went to the footnotes, in the opening chapters of the book, he was explaining it was a huge concern of his that Mexicans would come to the United States, they would outpopulate the native population, and then they would ruin the country. And the sources that he cited for proof of this were the social science articles from the 1920s and 30s. It was really, this guy was like, Samuel Huntington was the dean of political scientists in the United States on the occasion of his death.
When was that?
2003.
Okay.
The book was...
What school was he at?
Harvard.
Oh, wow.
Oh, Huntington.
Yeah, Samuel Huntington.
You're saying he was relying on research from like 50 years previously?
So like the footnotes that he was using to kind of show that Mexican immigration is going to be a big problem for the identity of this country because they're going to bring their Catholicism and take it over, were these social science articles. The only way I found out about these social science articles from the 20s and 30s is that when I was reading Samuel Huntington's book in 2003, I looked at the footnotes and I was shocked that he was quoting as his source these old social science articles. Right?
Are you saying that just to show that he's a phony, or to show? Well,
I think it shows. I think what it shows is that it's, first of all, it's not good social science, but I think secondly that among the elites there's this ongoing fear among the elites of Catholicism, and it persists, right? It persists probably to this day. So it's just to show that. Yes.
Was he also making the argument, or some of the elites making the argument, that this has actually happened, that Catholics do have more of a majority and
no.
They are causing problems?
No, because
they think that with this work, the contraceptive.
I think the plans that got put in place, or the mentality that was adopted in the 1930s, and the various ways that the various cultural, if you want to put it this way, I know not everybody likes using this language, but the various cultural battles that took place between 1940 and 1980, that the Catholics, if you want to say this like word, like the Catholics lost all those battles. Mm-hmm. So whatever was the mentality or the concerns or the efforts that were tried to divide and neutralize the church, at least for that time period, they seem to have succeeded.
But with the incoming Hispanics, they got nervous again.
Yeah.
Because they're like, we broke down the Irish and the
Right.
Poles and all that, and they're all
Right.
accepting now.
Right.
They're under control, but now the Hispanics were nervous again.
Exactly.
Because,
Yeah.
So that's the issue.
So the issue is, this year there was 60,000 baptism in the Diocese of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
That's the issue. There were almost none in the Diocese of New York. Infant baptisms, comparatively speaking.
That's interesting.
Right? Yes.
This is more of a general question, but it seems like there's a trend that a lot of religious nations, both Christian and Muslim, are being more and more westernized and secularized. So, such that kind of Mexican immigrants, do you kind of know how Catholic are the Mexican immigrants coming in?
No, our next door neighbor at Winmore, who deals with the history of devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? The way he kind of summarizes it, he says, catechesis. Catholicism in Mexico is thin, is widespread, but thin, and there's a lot of ideas in their heads that are crazy Enlightenment ideas, and they're not even fully conscious of it, because in if you go back to the 1820s, right? Just to take a little bit of history here, right? So if you go back to the Napoleonic era, when Spain loses the empire, the Masons, Modern Enlightenment, Radical Enlightenment, all these fellows are kind of making their inroads into all the Latin American countries. And so finally, when the Spanish Empire falls apart, when the colonies were self-governed in a sense, let's say from 1800 to 1820, whatever, they were ruled by these juntas. And I think we already said it. On these juntas, you would get, a general, mix of everything, maybe one Catholic. In many Latin American countries, when you go there, like I remember going to Ecuador once, and there's this one Catholic politician in the 19th century, and he was assassinated as president of Ecuador, right? But in Mexico, the Catholic Church, beginning in 1820-something, is outlawed. And it remains outlawed, the Catholic Church remains outlawed in Mexico until 1990-something. And so the government, and what's taught in the public schools, and what the government teaches is crazy. Right? It's some sort of like weird confection of Enlightenment thought plus masonries plus whatever. And so a lot of Hispanics from many of the Mexican countries, as we call them, right? They have a very thin catechesis, and just because of the education they've received in the public schools, they have all sorts of crazy ideas. Right? So when they come to this country, a lot of times they have their families, but they're very susceptible to whatever crazy ideas they're going to get taught in the public schools.
So was the person writing it for fear of Catholicism or for fear of ethnic mixing in a sense?
Well, to be honest, I think Samuel Huntington. No, I think Samuel Huntington was one of these academics who worked very closely with the elites in Washington, and he's one of the trying to control the population. And I think he wanted to point to a problem, basically just to make sure that the elite, to signal to the policymakers that we just got to make sure that we know how to do our job. We got to make sure we do it with these guys. Right? In other words, a friend of mine who was doing a research project on Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time magazine from the 1930s until he died in the 1970s. He unearthed CIA documents from the 50s in which the CIA was working with a professor at Catholic University, basically saying, and they were developing this program called doctrinal warfare, right? And the idea of doctrinal warfare was to enter into the intellectual life of the Catholic Church, to promote faction and heresy and schism. And precisely it was to enter into on both sides of the political spectrum, So both on the liberal side, Democratic side, and then also on whatever became the conservative side, and actually to promote division that way. But to do it through promoting division on the realm of ideas. That's why they called it doctrinal warfare. And actually, it's funny because when my friend was doing this project, he wasn't even looking for this. No, it's not Michael Jones. It's another friend. So he wasn't even looking for this because he was just writing, like, he was just interested in the life of Henry Luce. And he was really shocked when he applied for, because he noticed that there were some documents that were about Henry Luce. But they were black. There was all this stuff that was blacked out. And he sued. He actually, you can go to court, and he said, look, these documents are about Henry Luce. The guy's been dead since the 60s. Whatever he was doing with the CIA, the New York Times reported already in the late 1960s that Henry Luce was always working with the CIA in his publication of Time magazine. Right? So that's already kind of publicly known.
That's like well documented.
Yeah, I mean the New York.
There's literally there's a document on the CIA website about it.
Operation Mockingbird.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
And it came out in the late 60s. I mean, and of course, also let's remember what magazine coined the term "the spirit of Vatican II"?
Time magazine.
Time magazine. Who was the man working for Time magazine?
Henry Luce.
No.
Samuel Huntington.
Who was the man working for Time magazine that coined that term?
John Courtney Murray.
No.
Gary Wills.
Michael Novak.
Whoa!
Michael Novak. At the time he was. At the time he was actually.
Wow. Then he became far right. He disrupted both sides of the church.
That makes me really suspicious about who he was. Exactly. You got it. You got it. You got it, Joe.
Amen, brother. Wow. And a lot of the words.
Who's Novak?
Michael Novak? Just go to the Catholic Information Center website in Washington, D.C., and you'll get access to all of his writings.
That's a personal work.
It has nothing to do with Opus Dei. No, he was an opportunist. The best I could say about him is that he was an opportunist who.
That's the best you can say.
What's the worst you can say about that?
Wasn't he at AEI?
Yeah, he was at AI for many years. He was a kind of public intellectual who was a stringer for Time magazine during the Second Vatican Council. He wrote a lot of articles covering the Second Vatican Council. And then in the 70s, and he was like a radical leftist in the 1960s. And then he kind of goes out of commission for 2 or 3 years, disappears, and then reappears in the late 1970s as like a Republican conservative. And then spent...
He converted too. No. I mean, you question it, but he claims to have.
He claims that to have had some sort of a change of heart.
Oh, but I mean, he was always Catholic, though.
He was always Catholic.
He was
even
always Catholic.
always in the 60s, he was always a Catholic.
Yeah, right. So
Oh, I didn't realize
he
this.
underwent an intellectual conversion.
Yeah,
All the worst
yeah.
journalists now
Extremely
are actually
professor
people who
Catholic.
work under him.
So-
I don't want to name names.
So when I was in grad school, when I was in undergrad and grad school, he was always promoted to me as like, you should become like Michael Novak. If you become like Michael Novak, you will have made it in this world, right? He was always promoted to me as like the hero Catholic intellectual, right? Which I think is a complete hypocrisy, but now, based on
Weigel's the man.
So anyway, and I have more stories about these guys. All these guys.
Weigel is a CIA plant.
That might be a bridge too far.
You said it. You have said it. You have. Joaquin says Weigel is a CIA plant. Write that down.
For the diary.
Well, no, but I mean, let's just take this opportunity to explain another strain here of development in political philosophy in the United States. Okay, so we need to explain. I mean, everyone in this room should understand after leaving this class what is a neoconservative,
Yes.
right? And where they come from, right? Because that's another. Because that's if the left's it's all clear to us what if this CIA document is true, right? So actually, just to go back to the document. So my friend was like, well, why is all this stuff blacked out? So he sued because you can go to these courts to basically say, look, if the CIA can't prove that the stuff that they've done in this document that they're still doing it, then it should be known. So when the first time he sued, the CIA's response was, the stuff in this document, these programs, some of them are still in operation. So therefore, that's why the stuff was blacked out. So then my friend sued. So then my friend sued again, and his argument the second time was, well, even if the stuff is in operation, Henry Luce is dead, and probably the people that are concerned in this memo are probably not alive anymore. And it's been a long enough period of time since they've died, so that even if the programs are in operation, you can at least give me like more information on Luce. So then they released more. They gave him another document with only just a few things blacked out, but the program of spreading heresies and schism and all this kind of stuff was then in that document. And so that led him to shift the whole focus of his book at that point.
And has he published his book yet?
Yeah, and actually he shifted it from a book not just on
Who published this?
Henry Luce,
Yeah.
but also on Henry Luce and John Courtney Murray.
Like, why don't people talk about
Because, and what he discovered is that Henry Luce was looking for a theologian to promote it through Time magazine, to kind of try to change the idea as part of this doctrinal warfare program.
What's this guy's name? Who wrote this book?
Henry Luce,
No, who wrote the book?
David Wemhoff.
Yeah, it's right here. On Amazon for $59.99.
What's the title?
I think he changed
John
it.
Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition.
So in the end, he realized that, what he unearthed in the end was that Luce was also, John Courtney Murray, in a sense, was also a little bit of creation of Time magazine. That they adopted him as their man in the early 50s. They used Time magazine to trash all of his opponents.
Who's
Right.
John Courtney Murray?
So John Courtney Murray became kind of ultimately he was on the commission at the Second Vatican Council that helped to write Dignitatis Humanae. He was really upset because he didn't get his way. There was another priest who was from the United States, a guy named Fenton, Monsignor Fenton. And Fenton was a big proponent of upholding the traditional teaching of the church, which is that the divine law is the model for the positive law. And that's John Courtney Murray had dedicated his whole career to getting that etched out of church documents.
What did you want instead?
He just wanted that there's really no model for the positive law, and we should just have pluralism.
Behold these truths.
Yeah, his famous book is called "We Hold These Truths." So, John Courtney Murray was on the committee that helped to write Dignitatis Humanae, the document on religious freedom. And at the last minute in the Second Vatican Council, because of the efforts of Fenton and one or two other people who I don't remember now at this point, they promulgated this document, but they added this one line, which is the traditional teaching of the church, that the divine law is the model and standard for the human law. And John Courtney Murray was infuriated. He was actually then the translator of the first translation of that document into English. He mistranslated it, and he left out the commentary. Or he made the commentary seem like that line was not in the document. In the first big translation that came out of the Second Vatican Council documents. When John Paul II came to Philadelphia in 78, 79, he gave a speech in Philadelphia. And it's really interesting now to read that speech. Because in the first chapter, in the first paragraph of the speech, he praises the United States, religious freedom, wonderful, I love you all. And then in the second paragraph he says, there's one thing I want you to keep in mind. And he quotes in Latin that line from the Second Vatican Council that Murray had misconstrued in the translation. And he said, we all have to keep in mind that the divine law is the standard for the human law, right? So John Paul II used his first speech in Philadelphia in 78, it was 78, 79, to basically make the correction. Without using anybody's name or humiliating anybody. But that kind of sent waves through it sent a message to a lot of people in the United States at that time, a lot of bishops and theologians, that he said that in that speech. So anyway, so that's, these things happen when you do research, right? Research can be scary sometimes. It can lead you down roads you don't want to go, that cost you your reputation especially in polite company, right? So anyway, we should speak about the origin of neoconservatism and say a little bit something about it. So really, there's a great book. It's written by a professor, this history professor at University of Pennsylvania, has written several, I think, very interesting books. His name is Murray Friedman. He wrote a great book on the civil rights movement called What Went Wrong? The History of the Black-Jewish Alliance. He wrote another great book on the history of neoconservatism, which I don't remember the exact title of it. But it's... anyway, his name is Murray Friedman.
Sounds like a neocon name. Jewish.
So anyway, there's probably other books now that tell these stories as well. But I think it's just another interesting example of how these things start, right? We've already seen it a little bit in looking at the 19th century in Europe. But essentially, the 1917, you have the Russian Revolution. There was all sorts of Americans who were more liberal became kind of enamored with the Russian Revolution. We all know the Russian Revolution, as all revolutions do, it divides up into factions, and the factions end up fighting civil wars against each other, right? And then by the 1930s, there's two major factions, the Stalinists and the Trotskyites. The major division, so basically after 10 years of chaos, the Trotskyites are motivated by the proposition the only way communism will succeed is if we spread chaos all over the world, right? In other words, we just got to go into every country all over the world and just spread revolution everywhere. That's kind of the Trotskyite ideal. Get rid of the family, get rid of all social corporate bodies. I mean, that's not their language, but that's our language, right? We got to just get rid of everything. Now, in the opening days of the Russian Revolution, they legalized divorce, they legalized abortion, they basically created kind of sexual chaos. By 1928, 29 or so, there was I think it was 8 to 10 million orphans in the Soviet Union. And so Stalin basically, his followers come in and they basically say, look, communism's great, but maybe what we should do is just try it in Russia first and then forget about the rest of the world. Because we got to stabilize Russia. So actually Stalin passes all sorts of laws to try to promote modesty to some degree, right? Get rid of this kind of chaos. And I have a friend who's done research on this. He actually claims that Stalin tried to follow the vision of modesty and purity of Kellogg, who was the Seventh-day Adventist, who gave us breakfast cereal. Because breakfast cereal would make you holy and to be ready for the second coming of Christ.
What?
Right? Yeah, that's Kellogg. Kellogg cornflakes.
Wow. You're ready. Quaker Oats.
This is just what he said.
No, in other words, he did. So in other words, the Seventh-day Adventists originate in the 1840s. This guy Miller predicts the end of the world in April 1843. It doesn't happen. So then he says it's going to be October 1843. It doesn't happen. And so then there's a bunch of break-off groups from the Millerite movement. One of them is the Seventh-day Adventists, and Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist. And the whole idea of Seventh-day Adventism was the rebirth, the end actually began in heaven in 1843. And so now we got to just prepare ourselves for when it descends onto earth. And for when it descends onto earth, you got to be ready to go.
Yeah.
And literally, Kellogg took that literally, and he said, and so they would develop the right kinds of foods so that you would be ready to go, right? So he developed all these cereals. Graham was another follower of seven.
Graham?
Yeah, like the Graham. He developed the graham cracker as like another form of food that would help you to be ready for when, the new heavens descended onto the earth.
Be quick, easy to get up and go, or that will spiritually prepare you.
Well, the two things are united. The two things are united. Right? So anyway, so by the 1930s in the United States, there are these two factions. There's the Marxists who are Stalinists, and the Marxists who are Trotskyites.
Is the United States or Russia?
Both in the U.S. and in Russia. And by the 1930s, they hate each other. But they're organized. One place where they're organized is in New York City, especially Brooklyn, and actually especially Hoboken, New Jersey.
Hoboken!
Right? We have another story about Hoboken someday. It's a great story. So, a bunch of Marxists are students at the City University of New York. You can still go to the lunchroom. You can still see there's two alcoves right near the door of the lunchroom of the City University of New York, the main campus. They would sit in these two doors, alcove A and alcove B. There's about 15 or 20 of them. They would argue with each other. So the Trotskyites were in one alcove. The Stalinists were in the other alcove. They would argue with each other about Marxist principles and communist principles. And then they would also try to convert anybody that came in. And many of the people who were in those two alcoves, two of the Trotskyites who were in those alcoves were Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol.
Oh, man! Both of which were neocons. Big stuff.
So Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol are the fathers of the grandfathers now of neoconservatism.
And their sons are wreaking havoc in our political system.
So I forget the names. Actually, when you go, if you ever read a book about this, or you see the list of names, it's actually quite impressive. The number of people in those two alcoves that went on to become like public intellectuals, not so many like academics, but like public intellectuals into policy and whatnot. The Stalinists, in those alcoves, when they eventually matured in the 40s and 50s, many of them became leaders in the civil rights movement and the Democratic Party. Because of various things that happened in the Second World War and at the beginning of the civil rights movement, many of those Trotskyites from the 30s in the early 1950s found themselves as libertarians. And they basically were thinking to themselves, libertarianism.
Are you talking about all these Marxists or only the Trotskyites?
I'm talking about the Trotskyites.
Okay.
The Stalinists tended to be continuous Stalinists, or they modified it a little bit, and they became democratic progressives in the civil rights movement. The Trotskyites tended to become, by the 1950s, libertarians. And a couple of the Trotskyites, by the middle of the 1950s, became really wealthy. They went into business, and they really became fairly wealthy. They then, in the 50s, they started to latch on to the Republican Party.
Who did?
The neoconservatives, Podhoretz and Irving Kristol. They also realized, they understood that if you're going to have an influence, you got to take over institutions. And since one or two of their fellows became wealthy, they began to set up a network in the 1950s that was a network of professors that they met at universities, institutes and think tanks that they started next to those universities, institutes and think tanks that they started in Washington to try to have influence in areas that they were especially interested in.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, sounds very familiar. Yes, right. And so they made contact with professors at Chicago, like Leo Strauss, and they also made professors. There was another professor at Chicago they made contact with who was in international relations, and also they made contacts with economics professors. They decided that the way they were going to enter into politics and have the biggest effect would be to do it on the level of domestic economy and international foreign policy. And they decided that if they were to really specialize in these two areas and become experts in these two areas and also offer money in these two areas, they could very quickly they could send people through the system and get them to become advisors for congressmen and senators, or get them as agents in the bureaucracy, in the State Department or in foreign affairs, and they could very quickly start to have their influence. And it worked. It worked. Within 10 to 15 years, one of their disciples was running the campaign of Barry Goldwater, which was a failed presidential campaign, but he was running the campaign.
What's his name?
I forget the name now.
Wait, you did?
I'm sorry, I just have to, because I wasn't planning this, so I didn't go over some of the names before I came in. They also got people on the staff of C.D. Jackson. C.D. Jackson, actually, as it turns out, he was a senator who was also a go-between between the CIA and Time Magazine, which I found out independently of this book. But he was also like a real foreign policy hawk. Like, we gotta nuke Russia. That was kind of his that was his line. We just gotta nuke Russia. And by the late 1950s, so they were kind of bitter opponents of the civil rights movement. They were bitter opponents of their adversaries from Alcove B, from their old days in the City University of New York. But by the late 1950s, they were setting up these. A lot of the institutes and think tanks that they set up were libertarian in their economic orientation and aggressive foreign policy. That's kind of just a way to summarize it.
Wait, can you just because I missed so Crystal and Podhoretz or whatever, they're the Stalinist guys or the Trotskyites?
They're the Trotskyites, right?
Heritage and Cato.
Yeah, for example, they set up Heritage, Cato. They set up the Liberty Fund. They also realized you got to set up foundations which can fund these institutes, right? So they realized you got to have a whole network, right? You got to have universities, you got to have foundations which give money, because they were also just imitating what they saw in a lot of other prominent foundations already that were established, like the Rockefeller, the Ford, the Carnegie, right? I mean, they were just, in a sense, they were just imitating in their own manner. This is how you enter into the system, right? By the one of the things that happened in the late 50s, early 60s, yes?
Sorry, can you just refresh me on, is it Trotskyites wanted to spread communism internationally and Stalinists just wanted to do Russia? That's the difference?
That's the big difference, yeah.
At least initially.
I would say Stalin, when you actually study Stalin in the end, I don't think he ever had plans on world domination.
Yeah, they were more worried about us.
They were more worried about us, hitting them. But that's another story also.
And what happened to the Trotskyites in Russia?
Well, eventually Stalin and his people just basically made them go underground.
And Trotsky got killed with a pickaxe.
And they sent an assassin to kill Trotsky in Mexico City. So they basically just went out of commission in Russia. I mean, there was probably still some there, but they were...
Was it Baruti?
Pardon?
Baruti was the name. Bill Baruti.
Who did what?
The Goldwater campaign.
I don't remember now. I don't know. It could have been. But anyway, another thing they also realized is you need to set up a magazine for the cultured reading class, like the lawyers and the doctors out there, because they're not going to read academic articles. So you need to set up a magazine that'll be and the magazine they set up was commentary.
Oh, really?
Yeah, commentary. right? Which comes into play in a few minutes. So, so they then, by the late 50s, they realized we got to branch out. We're not Christian. There's no Christians in our group, right? So they realized we got to start reaching out, and who we're going to reach out to, but the Catholics. So they started an institute for trying to basically recruit Catholics from Catholic campuses or public schools, but it would be like, they also realized you got to set up student groups as part of recruiting people in to become professors and whatnot. So the initial institute they set up for recruiting Catholics was
No way!
the Institute of Social Individualists.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my.
And did they eventually become the other ISM?
So, but the problem was, in its first 5 years, they got no Catholics to join. They couldn't get any Catholics to join the Institute of Social Individualists, so they changed the name to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute.
Wow! You're kidding.
I am not kidding.
I'm sure a bunch of people.
I swear on my grandmother's grave.
Phil's sister was.
Phil's brother. Like all my siblings are communists.
They're crypto communists.
Crypto Nazis. Crypto Nazis.
Yes.
Did the people working at these institutions know that these institutions were promoting communism in some way?
No. By this point, they're not communists. By this point, they're libertarians.
They're libertarians. They did actually change.
By this point, they're leftists. By this point, using our categories from the French Revolution, by this point they're leftists in the French Revolution. They're moderate to radical Enlightenment fellows. No, they are. I mean, that's what the libertarian movement is. I mean, from the French Revolution categories, right? They're not conservatives in that sense, but that's what conservatism becomes.
What was it again? Institute for what?
Institute for Social Individualists.
Oh, yes, for social. Okay.
Socialist individuals.
Institute for Social Individualists.
And now it's
The Intercollegiate Studies Institute.
which is, what is it?
So it's the same thing as it was. It's the same thing that it was when it was founded. It's an institute set up to recruit undergraduates into the conservative movement to see if they're capable of going to graduate school or going into politics or going into journalism, to then eventually give them access to funds to help them in whatever advanced studies they need to go either into policy, journalism, or academia.
Now, wasn't Buckley involved with ISI?
Buckley was one of their frontmen. Yeah, Buckley made it.
Buckley was a Trotskyite?
No. But Buckley, by the late 50s and early 60s, Buckley made an alliance with these people.
Amazing.
Because Buckley started, how we were talking in the 19th century, right? All these people started like Young Frenchmen for Freedom and whatnot. And Buckley starts in the 1960s, Young Americans for Freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Buckley.
Young YAF too?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Buckley goes along with these guys to start National Review.
What? Wait.
sorry.
Nationally, every single I was a Trotskyite?
Yes, former Trotskyite.
The reactions make it sound like people have missed the point that they've become essentially libertarians, right? So all they're really concerned with, they don't care about trashing Catholicism. They just want to make us economically libertarian. That's their goal.
Yeah. And aggressive in foreign
It's not
policy.
like they want us to be like crypto communists.
So is this so you're presenting the social movement as sort of a coherent conspiracy, for lack of a better word.
Well, no, I mean, it is.
It's not a conspiracy.
Look, at history, you got a choice. At some point in your life, you got to make a choice,
Okay.
right? History is either blind forces at work, or it's persons who do things that have effects, right?
Okay.
So at some point, you got to make that choice in your life.
I mean, so people were my point is,
Choose right now.
No, but I mean,
people working together, is this just a group of people who are originally connected with the
No,
Trotskyites?
these are people who are Trotskyites. By the mid 1950s, they've all kind of had a change of the thinking, as far as they don't think of themselves as Marxist Trotskyites anymore.
They're no longer young idealists.
They think of themselves as libertarians. But at the same time, they think big. They're not thinking like, oh, I'm just going to go back to Chicago and become a lawyer and, get a job in middle management and be somebody's brown nose the rest of my life and live a comfortable life in the suburbs and have my swimming pool. They're not thinking that way.
No.
They're thinking, one thing they're thinking is, I hate those Stalinists who are becoming leaders in the civil rights movement. Right? I mean, they are a little bit motivated by hatred, because for some of them, hatred is a virtue.
That's right.
Goldwater and
Right? So they're a little bit motivated by hatred and vengeance. They hate their confreres, their opponents from City University of New York that are in the civil rights movement. And a little bit, they just think, the best world would be is if this country became libertarian in economics and like super aggressive in its foreign policy. We could wipe out the Russians. They also have a little bit of a hatred of the Russians because many of their grandparents came from Russia in the 1890s, right? So they basically think the best thing for the United States would be is if we had libertarian economics and a real kind of we're going to rule the world foreign policy. And they're thinking big. To their credit, they're not thinking just, I'm just going to go home to my city and, sit on my porch, be a little back porch Republican, and, complain about things. They're thinking like, and they're thinking in a concrete way. How can my ideas get implemented into policies, given that we're in America in 1950, whatever?
So
all right.
Goldwater, remember these?
I think they latched on. I think in others that then they start looking. So then, Podhoretz and Crystal were conspirators. They worked together. They worked with this wealthy guy who gave them a lot of money, right? They funded magazines. They got the money for the foundations. They started finding, through these institutions, they would start meeting students who they would promote. They promoted the scholarship of Leo Strauss. They tried to find students who would go to Chicago and study with Strauss. They came up with scholarships for these students so they could study with Strauss. Because in those days, if you had money and you applied to a school, they'd be more than happy to take your money. So they realized the practical way, this is how you build a political movement, and to their credit, they did it.
What Templeton?
I don't know so much about Templeton. But then in the 60s, by the early 60s, they realized, if this is going to work, we need a massive movement. We need to get, in other words, ideas. We need things like National Review to communicate our ideas to your. There's a whole population out there. They only read 200-word articles, and we got to basically communicate the ideas to them. So National Review, right? In 1967, 68, one of their followers, a guy named Kevin Phillips. Kevin Phillips writes a book called The Emerging Republican Majority. In that book, he says it's clear the Democratic Party is, in the next few years, they're going to basically embrace the sexual revolution. When they do that, out of revulsion, you're going to get probably up to half the Catholics are going to be looking for an alternative. So Phillips basically says, what we need to do is we need to adopt an electoral policy that during elections we need to kind of be pro-life in our rhetoric and pro-family. We don't have to say anything about economics or foreign policy, and we'll get half the Catholic vote. Kevin Phillips, The Emerging Republican Majority, 1967. He takes that out of, I think there's 4 or 5 editions of that book. You got to read the first edition to read that, because he takes it out of the later editions. Richard Nixon reads that. One of Richard Nixon's advisors, who was a neocon, he gives that book to Nixon, and Nixon understood. He understood. So he basically, in '72, he guarantees this is now going to be the platform of the Republican Party. And Reagan seizes on that platform, and he succeeds in doing it.
And they both killed it electorally.
And from an electoral standpoint, it was correct.
Yeah.
The question is, have they ever delivered on it politically? That's the question. right? Because Reagan appointed judges like Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor, who gave us Casey, the Casey decision of 1992 or 3, whatever that was. So in a sense, Reagan didn't deliver, George Bush didn't deliver, right? So one of the questions is, will they ever deliver?
You're leaving off.
Right?
Who got Scalia?
Well, I mean, in other words, the idea, you could say the idea was to appoint enough people so you'd always have a 5-4, but never go over 5-4, right? So you keep it close, but no cigar, right? Now, by the way, also, I mean, I had an uncle who was the head of the Teamsters Union, right? And just as a sign, right, the Teamsters Union historically is always Democrat, right? Well, all of a sudden, I remember my aunt telling me these stories before she died. She was asking me this, and I didn't know this at the time. She just asked me this question once. And she said, well, you know, I never quite figured it out. Like, why did Nixon start inviting Frank and me to dinner every week at the White House? I never figured that out. She went to her grave and she never figured it out. But I think I know why. I think now I know why.
I don't. Can you be more explicit?
The Teamsters Union is the biggest union in the United States.
Yeah.
If they become friends with the president of the Teamsters Union and the Republicans, right, he's going to start basically saying you can vote for Republicans.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Right?
It seemed like that ever worked. Until
Pardon?
This last election.
Well, for
No,
Reagan, the union.
Yeah, I think actually Reagan and Nixon did pretty well with you.
At least a lot of people in Detroit who were union guys voted for the Republicans. Reagan.
Okay, yeah.
Thomas.
Was the Tea Party movement? Would you consider was that more neocon?
I think actually, I think a tea. To be honest, it was just my short elevator speech of the Tea Party movement. It was the first. It was the first kind of like visceral awareness that the neocons had kind of taken control of the Republican Party, and it was a reaction. It was a visceral reaction against it.
Because it was all libertarian.
Yeah, it was kind of libertarian, but but I think also you can see. I think also you see very quickly in the Tea Party movement that the Republican Party sends operatives into it to try to co-opt it. Because in electoral politics, if there's like a grassroots rebellion, one thing you do is you try to basically send some of your operatives into that wing of the party so that you can kind of bring the grassroots back in. Right? So I think there was a kind of, like I have other uncles in Michigan. They were all like, these guys were all like engineers for the auto companies. And they were like huge supporters of Pat Buchanan. Huge supporters of Pat Buchanan. And they were out in the streets of Michigan, up and down Michigan. Pat Buchanan ran for president in 92 and 96.
And should have won.
And, but basically, like that's the Tea Party. I think that at least in the Midwest, a lot of the Tea Party types were those kind of people. They were like my uncles who were just like, well, I'm fed up. Something's wrong. I don't know exactly what it is, but all I know is that these Republicans in Washington, they don't care what I say, and we need new candidates who care about like what an engineer in Ford Motor Company wants, you know. And so they were like big Pat Buchanan Tea Party types. That's, I think, the rebellion against the neocon takeover of the party in the 90s and early 2000s. So I kind of think it kind of works. Then actually it's interesting. I have 3 data points on this next point, right? By the late 70s, they realized we need a Catholic magazine that's the equivalent of commentary.
Wait for it.
So the first thing they do...
Who's they?
First things.
Crystal and Podorus, Norman Podorus. Crystal and Podorus. So the first thing they do is they go to Rockford, Illinois, and they basically start funneling money into the Rockford Institute, which produces a magazine called...
First things.
No.
Crisis.
No. What's the Rockford magazine called? Thomas Fleming is the editor of it. Or he was the editor of it. Anyway, it's kind of it's now known as a kind of paleo-conservative magazine. But anyway, pardon? Chronicles, yeah.
Magazine of American culture.
Yeah, Chronicles. So they start funneling money into Chronicles. with the idea that they're going to get Chronicles to shift to be like a popular magazine, but with aggressive foreign policy and libertarian economics. And Fleming at one point says, and actually this story is also in the New York Times. So what I'm telling you is not, it's also in this book, right? Right. So Fleming basically says, well, no, I'm not going to do that. Thanks for the money, thanks for the gift, but I'm not going to change the editorial policy of my magazine just for some, for filthy lucre. I'm not an intellectual you-know-what. So at this point, Richard John Newhouse shows up.
Oh, no.
And Richard John Newhouse says, with this money, I'm now the editor of the magazine. And you're out, Fleming. And actually, it's really funny because they at one point, there's a dinner in New York. And after the dinner in New York, there's a car chase over who gets the money and whatnot. And eventually, Newhouse makes off with the money. With that money, they buy a magazine in New York called One World magazine, and they change the name to First Things.
No.
Yes way.
You're
yes way.
joking.
I am not joking. I am not joking.
First Things is a.
It's a neocon magazine. Yes, for Catholics. Because the deal with First Things was you can say all you want about social things and morality, just don't criticize foreign policy, and don't criticize too heavily radical, libertarian economics.
Wow.
And you will never go out of publication. You'll never run out of money.
And where is First Things published out of?
New York.
New York, like a few blocks from Murray Hill.
Yeah.
Isn't it connected with Witherspoon somehow?
I don't think so. Unless something's changed in the last couple of years. So, but then at this point, they made their march through every major Catholic magazine. So, for example, I remember as a grad student, Ralph McInerney. Ralph McInerney was the editor of Crisis magazine before it died, before its resurrection on the internet. And I remember Ralph McInerney coming to class really tired, right? And like, why are you so tired? Well, I got a late night phone call last night from Michael Novak. Well, why was he calling you at 2 a.m? Well, Crisis Magazine just published an article, and Norman's not happy. Norman is not happy. If we publish more articles like this, we're going to lose money, and the magazine's going to go out of business.
Norman.
Podhoretz. Right? So Podhoretz, basically, Joe Ritchie tells me, from his vantage point, and actually, I know one other guy. I know the editor of the New Oxford Review. He got a phone call in the middle of the night, where basically they said, "Will you take?" They basically said to him, "Will you take money from us in exchange for not criticizing aggressive American foreign policy and always promoting libertarian economics? We guarantee you your magazine will never go out of business if you do this." He said, "Absolutely not. I won't take your money." A week later, his magazine was trashed at First Things.
Interesting.
I mean, but because the offer was made.
No, this is a different magazine.
So basically, Podhoretz and Irving Kristol, they were very good friends with Richard John Newhouse. They were good friends with Michael Novak. They made sure these guys got all the money they wanted for magazines that they started, if they would soften their stance on aggressive foreign policy and libertarian economics.